He is in his second year, started in the fall of 2023, working on numerical simulation of heavy particle transport, large eddy simulation. So today Logan is going to talk to us about some of the numerical and computational considerations for doing simulations of these sorts of flows.
Thank you, Scott. Hello everyone. Today my talk is going to be hopefully pretty general, so everyone can get something out of it. It's not all going to be saltation like the last one. So I'll go ahead and start with an overview of sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll start with what is dispersed multiphase flow and why do we care about it. It shows up in a lot of different places, some pretty interesting. Then I'll go on to discuss sort of what impact the dispersed phase has on the flow. There's several different interactions that can get quite complicated. And then lastly, second to lastly, I'll discuss some of the modeling methods that are used. There's sort of 5 different approaches into 3 families. We'll go through all those. And then I'll wrap everything up with a discussion of like which of those approaches fits best for your different needs. There's some really useful insights we can get out of that discussion as well. So starting with the definition of what is dispersed multiphase flow, it's a really simple definition which leads to like a really broad application. So it's really just flow with at least 2 parts. One, which is a dispersed phase, which is sort of not continuous in space, and the other is the continuous phase, which is continuous in space. The only sort of like real constraint on these is the continuous phase must be a fluid, so gas or liquid. But the dispersed phase doesn't have many constraints on it. You can see this like really basic sort of picture here. Really no bells and whistles with this sort of description. And because of that, it shows up in a lot of different places. So here are like several different examples. Some more familiar maybe in the geophysics with clouds, dust storms, avalanches, and river sediment transport. Got some really nice photos here. But then also in some maybe less familiar places like biology, they use this sort of description for blood, mucus, respiratory airflow, and pollen transport. So it shows up in like biology in a lot of different cases, as well as in industry. Maybe like the most dramatic example being the bubbly flow in nuclear reactors. Understanding the sort of flow characteristics in that setting is really critical. And then maybe some less interesting applications in industry like sprays for different paints and coatings and fluidized beds. So it's sort of a very broad class of flows with really sort of diverse applications. Why I care about it personally, I'm sort of studying blowing snow. That's my actual project, which itself has lots of different applications. So I'll just go over those briefly. It has a pretty large impact on the Arctic and Antarctic surface mass balance, which is really critical for climate models. Shows up in civil engineering. There's a photo here at the bottom right, which shows like a ground blizzard. So sort of understanding how to predict that and how that affects visibility is important for civil engineering and roads. And shows up in different alpine settings. So with things like avalanche forecasts, stuff like hydrology, understanding how that snow pattern sort of distributes itself in these alpine settings is pretty important. So that's sort of the motivation. So now we'll go into how does it affect the flow. So we'll start with these multi-phase mechanisms. The first of which is something called the inertia effect. So the way this works is the density of the multi-phase mixture starts to depend on the volume fraction of the dispersed phase. So if you have heavy particles inside of this multi-phase setting, you have this relationship with this volume fraction denoted by phi and density. So you get this density dependence due to this introduction of the particles or the dispersed phase. And sort of a consequence of that is our next effect, the body force effect. So here you can see an example of a buoyancy-driven sort of flow that comes about from a non-uniform distribution of particles. So you can end up with a situation where you have sort of higher volume fraction above a lower volume fraction region, and you get sort of buoyancy-driven flow simply from the sort of existence or inclusion of particles in the multi-phase setting. So if you start treating the particles in sort of more detailed sort of perspective and start including the actual volume they occupy and the effect that has on the sort of continuous phase that they're sort of dispersed within, then you actually see like an additional effect called the volume effect, which introduces an additional effective compressibility term. So at this point, it's worth taking a pause and just sort of, reiterating, we started with a well-behaved, boring, not moving quiescent fluid, and just by sort of randomly adding particles, we've got a lot of additional effects that have really complicated our sort of scenario that we're having to deal with. And we have two more that just get worse. So this one's sort of an interesting one. It has some interesting history and like a little fun fact. This was Einstein's PhD thesis. I found out about that recently. That's pretty neat. A lot of the tensor notation that he used for general relativity was sort of like first sort of grown out of the fluid dynamics community. So that's pretty neat. But the effect is the thermodynamic and transport effect. So this is a consequence of including some of the additional boundary conditions that you get out of particles to your dynamic system. And those additional boundary conditions results in this modification of thermal conductivity and viscosity. So here again, we've added particles and now we have this viscosity dependence on particle volume fraction. So that's sort of really tricky to deal with and leads to some interesting consequences. And then the last of these major effects is the slip effect. This is like a really general sort of thing. So it's a generalized consequence of the difference between the particle properties and the fluid properties. So a lot of the times these are sort of grouped into these three categories: velocity, temperature, and pressure. So if you have these different particles, with the properties that are not the same as the fluid they're sort of embedded in, you end up with these wake effects, which not only influence the fluid, but as illustrated here in this image, you can get these what are called fluid-mediated particle-particle interactions. And these are sort of some of the trickiest things to actually get right in models. So just add that to the pile of all sorts of crazy things that have happened to our fluid just by adding particles. And we can sort of see that this whole process can get pretty messy. So we'll go ahead and dive into some of the modeling techniques, and we'll see how we can start tackling some of those with some different approaches after that. So I'm going to start this discussion of modeling approaches with something called the particle resolved approach. This is like the creme de la creme. This is the highest accuracy approach. You give it a ton of computational power, and it will be able to handle things for you, which is nice. If you have a small enough grid size and you can resolve the entire particle, usually at least a couple orders of magnitude grid size smaller than the particle, so you get really high detail of particle shape that you're resolving in these models. If you do that, this approach will handle all of that multi-phase headache for you. It just comes out of the physics. If you give it enough computer power, it will take care of all that headache for you, which is really nice. But of course, computational power is limited. These things scale really poorly. So there's some drawbacks. And I'll go through the pros and cons here in a second. So let's say that you don't have as much computer power to throw at this problem, and you're willing to bear some of the burden of modeling for yourself. You can go to this sort of next sort of second tier of Euler-Lagrange approach. So here we have a model that has a coarser grid resolution to the point that it no longer resolves the entire particle, or sort of critically, the sort of boundary flows beyond or around the particles. So all that sort of slip effect stuff is no longer being resolved explicitly, and you're going to have to model it, which is sort of a wrinkle that you're going to have to find a way to deal with. And this sort of leads into some like nice synergy between these different approaches. The insights you can gain from those explicit particle resolved approach can be used to sort of help model in these Euler-Lagrange approach. So even if you're simulating something that maybe is too big to do the particle resolved approach, there's still a lot of utility in exploring the particle resolved approach to inform and sort of double check that your models are still working properly. So the Euler-Lagrange approach is sort of big, important, special thing is this second bullet point here, that it treats the particles as if they're Lagrangian. So they do have a trajectory that you're tracking through time, and you're able to do some of these, Newtonian physics kind of things to keep things sort of reasonable and not having to make any crazy assumptions. You do have to model some of these slip effects, but you're still sort of doing a good job capturing the physics of the situation. Which brings us to our next approach. So let's say you want to model something really big, or you want to do something really computationally efficient. This is where you get into this Euler-Euler approach. So the way this one works is sort of radically different from the physics of the situation and involves some pretty clever modeling techniques. But sometimes it's called the two-fluid approach because its whole special thing is it models the dispersed phase as if it were a second fluid. So you have the fluid from the continuous phase, and a new fluid you're sort of introducing in the form of this dispersed phase. So sort of the consequence of this is that you're representing this dispersed phase as some kind of field, so all the different properties are represented as field properties, and it leaves a lot of sort of modeling and closure problems on your hands. So you have to be able to handle these things correctly, and it requires a lot of validation to make sure that some of your closure schemes, some of the model schemes you're doing are sort of conservative and doing the right thing and not behaving too sort of badly. So the sort of utility of the Euler-Euler approach is that it's computationally inexpensive. So you can sort of push that even further by making additional assumptions. So the big assumption for this equilibrium Eulerian approach, which is this first simplified version of Euler-Euler, is that the particles can be assumed to be quote unquote sufficiently small that allows you to sort of, instead of explicitly solving for this dispersed phase fluid, you can calculate the dispersed phase from the continuous phase. So instead of having to like calculate as you go along two different fluids, you sort of handle one fluid and then at each time step calculate the other fluid. So it saves you some time depending on how complicated those relationships are. With sufficiently small particles, that is actually computationally efficient and saves you a lot of time. Taking that to a sort of natural conclusion, all the way to the limit, you get the dusty gas approach, where you say, well, what if the particles are just absolutely tiny, so we don't even have to have any sort of like functional relationship to calculate them. They're just some simple modification to the single phase flow. And that's where you get this dusty gas approach. If you're dealing with really small particles, this is a really good way to go about it. All the other terms, all the different effects I talked about, for really small particles, they really don't have a huge effect, and you can save yourself just a ton of computational power by not having to deal with those. So depending on the context and the situation, you're going to want to be able to like pick the right one. We'll go through some pros and cons that might help you inform it, and then we'll discuss a different approach. So this is going to be a lot of sort of rehashing and reviewing what I just discussed, but I wanted to be explicit here. For the particle resolved approach, it's sort of big, like positive, is that there's no modeling required whenever you're doing DNS. So in that case, you're resolving the fluid stuff all the way. You don't have to deal with any sort of modeling. And then even if you're going to do something like LES, the only closure models you need are the sort of typical single phase closure schemes and modeling schemes. So you don't have to do anything novel to account for these multi-phase effects. So that's sort of the really, really nice thing about it. And the really, really bad thing about it is that it's super computationally expensive. And that's just the trade-off you have. The computational expense in many cases actually prohibits it from being useful. Like if you want to simulate a large thing like snow deposition in an alpine setting, you just can't possibly simulate something of that volume. There's too many particles. There's not enough computing power to do that. So it is limited by this computational cost. So moving on to the pros and cons of the Euler-Lagrange approach. One of the big pros, this is maybe a little philosophical, but I do think it's really important and positive that this simulation closely resembles physics. Like it's an intuitive way to model these things. You have particles moving around, they have histories, they have trajectories. It's good that this approach sort of simulates that in like a really explicit way. So that I think is a pro. A lot of the other pros and a lot of the other cons sort of come from it being the sort of middle ground between the particle resolved and the Euler-Euler. So the pros are there's fewer assumptions, especially in the DNS case, than you would if you were doing Euler-Euler. Still have to make some assumptions, unlike with the particle resolved method. So sort of the middle road. And then the other big pro is a lot of these different like volume effects and transport effects are really easy to port into these kinds of things as closures and model schemes from the particle resolved models. So it's sort of natural and easy to run high fidelity particle resolved models and get some good confidence and agreement in the Euler-Lagrange approach for some of these effects. The con is that it is higher computational cost than it is for Euler-Euler, but you have to make more assumptions, especially in the LES case, than you do for the particle resolved. So sort of good because it's the middle ground, bad because it's the middle ground. But sort of depending on the context, it can be really important. So leads us to the last one I'll do pros and cons of, the Euler-Euler method. So this one, the big claim to fame is it is computationally efficient. You can simulate a lot of particles, you can simulate a big volume, and you don't have to worry about running out of computational power or having to make some different sort of dramatic changes to what you're simulating or how you're going to do it. It's particularly well suited for RANS and LES, not altogether surprising given that those are sort of modeling approaches that themselves focus on computational efficiency compared to DNS. And it's also, despite sort of its, simplifications to be able to hit this sort of computational efficiency, it is pretty good at representing these inertial and body forces effects. So those are the pros. The cons is that it's on you to get your modeling and your closures right. Sometimes that's incredibly difficult. And you sort of have to make the decision of whether or not that computational cost or computational efficiency is worth the cost of some of these modeling techniques that you have to use. And then the other con is that this is sort of not altogether physically consistent, sort of the opposite of what you got from the Euler-Lagrange approach. It's a somewhat strange thing to look at all these particles with all their different trajectories and say, you know what, I'm going to treat that as a fluid. So sort of, I think that is a con. Again, somewhat philosophical, so maybe not as concerning. So with all of those different sort of methods available, how do you go about picking which model to use? So I'm actually going to take this opportunity to introduce what is potentially a very sort of overwhelming model or image here. And this is sort of like a general phase space of flow and particle properties with several regions with different sort of physical phenomenon isolated into these different regions of this phase space. The big takeaway here is that for many of these, you can get good separation in this phase space. So like if you look at this purple box with the geometric effects, it's sort of well separated from, say, the one-way coupling sort of thing. And so you can sort of slice out, depending on where you are in this phase space, the relevant physical phenomenon. There are some regions that are busier than others, right? Sort of near the origin, you sort of get a little bit busy. But the sort of principle that's illustrated here of this sort of utility of phase space being able to separate and identify sort of important things is what I want to draw your attention to and actually introduce a different phase space that's maybe a little more useful whenever you're making decisions about your modeling technique. So this is a model phase space where on the sort of vertical axis here, you've got the ratio between your particle size and your grid spacing. And then on the sort of y-axis, you've got the phi, which is your particle volume fraction. So you can see between all of our different choices, there's a really strong correlation or a strong sort of sorting. And I will say this is sort of back of the envelope. It's not hard and fast, but just as a general visualization, a good separation between all these different methods based on the ratio of the particle size to your sort of grid size. And that leads to like a really important sort of thing that I mentioned in the pros of the Euler-Euler, but it works really well with LES. By sort of pumping up the denominator of that ratio by sort of taking larger grid sizes, you can sort of run yourself down the ladder to some of these more computationally efficient regions without having to do like compromise on the types of particles you can simulate. Again, that comes at a cost. You have to do more modeling, and there's more closure schemes you have to sort of think about. But that's sort of the utility of it. And then just one last comment I'll make is on the volume fraction, so the sort of y-axis. The sort of critical feature of this is in deciding sort of the relevant multiphase effects. There's a lot of discussion you can do about this one- and two-way coupling, or the four-way coupling or three-way coupling, which has been sort of omitted. If anyone's curious, I do have additional slides I can go over, but I figured I'd cut it for time. I didn't want to bore anyone with that too much. So this sort of model phase space idea can give us a lot of insight into what we need to account for, methods that are well suited to account for those, and I think a really approachable way. So if you find yourself ever thinking, hey, this is kind of like dispersed multiphase flow, sort of, I hope this is the thing that you can take away, that there's sort of a nice tool out there that can maybe really help you make some informed modeling decisions. So I'll go ahead and summarize. So started off just describing and sharing some examples of these dispersed multiphase flows. Moved on to sort of all the headaches you can get whenever you're dealing with these things. So dealing with dispersed multiphase flows can profoundly modify the behavior of the flow. Then I moved on to describing some of the models, the sort of big three families, of course, being particle resolved, Euler-Lagrange, and Euler-Euler. And then concluded with a brief consideration of the sort of phase space insights that we can get from that. So I'll go ahead and conclude that and open it up for questions.
So I'd like to open the floor to questions here in the room, and we have a handful of people online as well. So folks are welcome to ask questions there too. Any questions here in the room?
I have a question. For your 3D diagram, can you go over that a little bit more about what each axis represents in it, so I understand what that was?
Yeah, of course. So I didn't go into a lot of detail here. I sort of wanted to drive that this could be pulled apart, but it's a perfectly fair question. So if you start with the sort of vertical axis, the z-axis, it's the ratio of the density for of your particle to your fluid. So with like sort of heavier particles, you sort of move up into that axis. So that if you look at the settling on sort of the back wall, that's the diagonal up, you can see that that sort of gets pulled closer to the origin. So the heavier particles are sort of more likely to settle, which sort of makes sense physically. If you look at the x-axis, the dp over eta, this is the ratio of your particle size to the smallest scale of turbulence. So it's like a scaled way to discuss particle size. So if you have really high turbulence, that scale gets driven down, so smaller particles get sort of scaled closer to the origin. Or if you have larger particles, it sort of pulls itself out further from the origin along that axis. And then the last one, the y direction coming out of the page at you, is your volume fraction. So the more particles you have, the sort of more complications you get. So for that axis, I think the granular flow sort of up on the wall and the suspended rheology down on the floor are really good ways to think about it. You can get like sort of sludge-like behavior, or you can get sort of like chunks that have to like move against each other, and you get some clogging phenomenon in this part of the phase space. Yeah, so it's sort of, I wanted the key takeaway to be that it can be sort of pulled apart. So a lot of these complications can be separated depending on these sort of flow and particle conditions. But yeah, I think it's a great image to really describe how much of a sort of mess this ends up, especially if you don't do the pulling apart. This is all just sort of, it can be, I don't know which of these is important. It's a lot to tackle. Yeah, so great question, thank you.
I was just curious on the next slide. There are two axes here on the left axis, second after so you get just one label value.
Yeah.
Where do you think that is now?
Yeah, so it's like two representations of the same kind of thing. So if you look at the middle one, sort of closer to the middle of the slide, that's the actual sort of like physical space. So you have diameter and the grid spacing. The one sort of closer to the diagram is the time scale. So it's just two different ways to think about it. I think that the sort of physical diameter is maybe more intuitive, but I think that the reason that a lot of the numbers are actually labeled for these timescales is it's sort of the more powerful and predictive of the two.